All right, we were interrupted on social stories. Um, so let me continue with that. And I was mentioning that, in fact, a lot of what Mr. Rogers did in his day was a form of social stories. The, um, the real advantage of the use of social stories, of course, is the personalization for the student. And so you're working on a very specific skill related to them, and you're making it personal for them. Most folks have heard of TEACH in the context of certainly of educating students with ASD. It's probably the most recognizable curriculum that you see. You can tell that it has been around for a while, even by the meaning of the acronym, which is now very politically incorrect. It was designed, to take advantage of, again, those visual strengths and preferences of students with ASD, and also their memory skills, and focuses on language development, cognitive, um, imitative kinds of skills, and building social skills using many of the methodologies that we've already discussed. It, and also, as we'll talk about in another presentation briefly, has assessment built into it as well. The visual schedules and supports, it sounds a little repetitious because we've talked about the use of visuals already, but just as an approach in general, it maximizes, again, that modality, really helps with scheduling and transitions. And it has been shown to really increase on-task behaviors because of the lowering of anxiety around predictability and the understanding that there's a certain amount of time that will be spent on a particular um, subject in the schedule, and that once that work is done, then the next thing on the schedule will occur. So it has helped with on-task behaviors. Incidental teaching always reminds me of Montessori's teachable moments, and it's just realizing, and teachers do this very automatically all of the time, that despite all the planning we do and the lessons that we have linked to our standards, etc., we can never pass up those teachable moments that occur just naturally and allow us the chance to again emphasize a skill that we're working on. So this is just a term that relates to, really grabbing those instances when they happen, using them as learning opportunities. When it's combined, kind of instantaneously with discrete trial training, it has been shown to have really positive results in particularly communication kinds of skills. Pivotal response treatment is a conscious look at what are kind of prioritizing skills that are needed. And so looking at the most pivotal, critical aspects of development where a student is lacking perhaps, and using that, the necessity of that, the functionality of that as a priority, and then often taking an ABA approach to working on those skills. So again, you're trying to modify the behaviors along that critical developmental arc so that the development can continue. Social skills training, I get concerned about this sometimes. When social skills training became very prominent in education, lots of curriculum was published and out there, and everyone wanted to use social skills training in a variety of populations. Um, it was often done in a very unnatural way. Run by an adult in a classroom where kids were role-playing situations they may have never experienced, and it was not transferable. It can be individualized. It obviously needs to be eventually in a group to work on the social aspects, and should really help when working with typical peers and the very core targets that we're looking at. You don't see generalization unless it's used authentically in the situations with peers and repeated. So some caution about the real effectiveness of some of the social skills trainings. The controversial interventions, you can't watch the news without hearing about the latest one. or the latest link to something that might cure ASD, or a link to some cause that could somehow be eradicated. Here we're talking about interventions in hopes of improving skills, and there's still that cure word used a lot, although nothing has been found that can claim to cure ASD at this point. But there are definitely unproven interventions, and then there are interventions that have been proven not to be very effective. So sensory integration is controversial. People fall on both sides of the whole issue around helping students better integrate the sensory stimuli they receive, because we know that's such a difficult thing for many, if not most students, to varying degrees who are on the spectrum. It's often a component of the OT that's provided. So it's really not been proven as a very successful intervention, and I think more studies needed, and certainly more really empirical kind of work to make any determinations there. What's not recommended is auditory integration training, that we're retraining the ear and improving the brain process, and doing remappings, things like that, that have been proven ineffective and almost fraudulent, and facilitated communication. Now, again, this is not AAC, but facilitated communication, where it came out of Australia. The initial studies done showing it to be very effective were later found to have been fabricated. The data was fraudulent. But it was a situation where folks were actually holding the arm of an individual who was nonverbal, and they were typing on a keyboard, and it was thought that there was this, sudden communication doorway open for folks. And certainly nonverbal folks can use a keyboard and communicate. But this methodology that involved this, adult who was physically holding on to the person's arm or wrist who was typing, it was found that, much like a Ouija board, they were being guided into many of the things that were typed. So it has been pretty much eliminated. I still see it, actually. It's still being used in California in some places, but most folks find it to be not useful and not really a valid or honest communication from the individual themselves. And we're going to wrap up with teaching self-management skills to folks on the spectrum, and it's the same as teaching self-management skills to others, except that we need to, take into account, again, very individually, what strategies are likely to work given the person's specific behaviors. So once we've identified the target behavior to work on and figured out what would work for that student specifically as a self-management technique, and we've explained that to the student, then preparing a self-recording sheet that would fit their skill level would actually be the next step. You have to model the plan, practice the plan. We're always looking towards self-management of skills for any student across the board, and it's no different with this population. Once the plan's implemented, the student needs to see their progress. The level of progress needs to be used to analyze if the plan needs to be changed. You need to know what reinforcement is going to work for that student. Once again, only the student knows what's reinforcing, so that has to be an appropriate choice, of course, but one that the student has some input into, and then incorporating it into not just the school, but working with the use of the plan at home as well. We all know that that transfer needs to happen in order for the consistency to be there, and then being able to fade the intervention. Ultimately, we don't want people needing to record their own behavior statistics all the time, but to ultimately self-regulate, which is the goal here.